Good morning, everyone. I am Gemma. I'm Amanda's daughter. I'm recording this in advance of the actual service itself from the territory of the Lekwungen, the Songhees, and the Esquimalt peoples. And the reason that I'm doing this in advance rather than on the day of is because on the 24th, I will be actually up on Shamakwam territory excavating at a village site there where I've been doing some work at a really interesting site where we've got a fire pit that has been going down into the ground for 50 centimeters, very compacted there in the ground. And where it starts out is about 6,000 years old to begin with. And going back, we're not sure quite how far in time, but yeah, thinking about many generations of people sitting around that fire pit, which is going to be pretty interesting. So I'm really excited that I get to share a little bit about my more local work this past summer here with you all, and that I also get to be a part of that work. So thank you for letting me record this in advance. Now, I'm sure some people here remember me as a child. I'm, as I mentioned, Amanda Tarling's daughter. And so when I was little, I was here and sitting at the front for the service or for the story, and then going over and playing during the service. And as I got older, I started working as one of the people that was helping to enrich the lives of the youth that were coming into the congregation. So it's a little bit about me, at least about how I grew up in relation to Capital Unitarian Congregation. And yeah, I guess with that, I can get started on the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is my work at Salish in Cordova Bay, which is a place that I've been working for about a year now. About a month of that has been field work that is actually present there, and the rest has been more of a structuring of my master's project around the work that's happening there. So we're going to be talking a little bit about why that work is important and what kind of visions surround the work that's happening in that area, and more broadly regarding heritage management in British Columbia. So I'm just going to share my screen. In a minute, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So I wanted to start out by acknowledging how I got interested in doing archaeological work. So the first project that I ever worked on was at a site called Kakmakimuth that is on Taushat territory out in the Broken Island group on the outer coast of Vancouver Island. This project was a part of a UVic field course that I got credit for in my undergrad, and I thought it sounded pretty interesting. The professor who was teaching the course, a lot of his work is surrounding extending historic baselines of fish species. Um, and so there was a very kind of very strong ecological component to this work. And I thought it was really interesting, through excavation at this village site that has been occupied for over 1,000 years, you've got an incredible record of all the species that people were bringing back to that place and ended up, just like our garbage today, like it's got to go somewhere. So you end up with all these incredibly preserved bones and shells from species going back thousands of years, which for an ecologist, like that's a bit of a dream scenario to be able to look at that kind of long-standing relationship between people and species in place. So this little tidbit that I have here is a piece of a gooey duck. Now, this is a species that was incredibly exciting for us to uncover on this project because Taushat First Nation is a part of the larger New Channel Tribal Council, and they have been in argument really with the province of British Columbia for years, trying to get harvesting rights. Well, I guess more formally with DFO, the Federal Department of Fisheries. And they've encountered barriers both at the provincial and at the federal level. even though they have elders saying, we've harvested geoduck, oral history saying that they've harvested geoduck, they weren't able to get harvesting rights for geoduck because the ministries basically disagreed, said, well, you probably weren't harvesting that. But then we're on the land doing this archaeological work, and the deposits that we're working with are about 800, 1,000 years old, where we were uncovering geoduck. And that's really powerful, thinking about how that archaeological work dovetails with the knowledge that's held by elders and held in oral history. Like there's a lot of being able to speak truth to power there. And so that moment when we uncovered this geoduck kind of set off a bunch of light bulbs in my brain thinking, wow, there's a lot of connection between the ecological side of things and the more kind of current socio-cultural legal side of things, which is the realm that my work is situated in, is between all of these factors. I mentioned a little bit about the professor leading this field school, Ian McCackney. He is somebody who does a lot of incredible work extending historic baselines, and it really gets you to think about the long-standing history of what life living on this coast would have looked like pre-industrialization and development. And now in the modern day, when we're thinking about adopting marine conservation areas, this is the kind of long-standing relationship to place and timeline that we want to be looking at when we're making this modern policy. So it's really interesting how connected this kind of broader scope and the here and now decisions of how to manage important fish species and in general just the landscape that we're interacting with as people is like how these two things come together really well. My slide is refusing. There we go. So in a few minutes, we're going to talk a bit about my own pathway into my master's from doing some consulting archaeology and realizing that wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. But for a second, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have our story. All right, that's more personal again. So on theme with the rest of what I'm talking about today, my story is actually going to be one written by Earl Claxton and John Eliot, who are both members of WSÁNEĆ, of various nations that are a part of WSÁNEĆ. And it's called Lachwel Nu. Trying to get the glare off of. There we go. They've got beautiful illustrations. You can see there's like a thunderbird rising up into the mountain there, and Lachwel Nu is actually the name of a mountain that, as we'll see, is very important in WSÁNEĆ history and story. And the name of the mountain is also the name of the tribal school that was established in the 1990s. And now a lot of youth in the area and the nations are able to go to that school and learn, curriculum that is general, but then also related to cultural teachings from their community, which is a really powerful thing to get to do. So, Lachwel Nu. In the beginning, Sals, our creator, taught the Saanich people how to take care of this land. For many years, I can't really read it while it's like that, the Saanich remembered Sal's words. They were happy and had plenty of food. Look at all this food. We've got somebody with a deer, somebody with a fish. It's a nice time. But as many years passed, some people broke Sal's words and forgot his teachings. It's not looking as nice in this time. Sals became unhappy and told the people that there would be a flood over the land. They were to prepare. They prepared a long rope of cedar bark. They gathered food and possessions. The tide waters began to rise. The people packed their belongings into their canoes. You can see all the canoes gathered along the shoreline there. Some people did not heed Sal's teachings. They were not prepared and they were washed away. Their canoes were destroyed. It's an unfortunate day on the water there. The water rose higher and higher. The people paddled to the highest mountain nearby. The trees were still above the water. It's the last mountain, Lachwilnu. They tied themselves to an arbutus tree on top of the mountain. Soon the tops of the trees were covered with water. They were afraid and prayed to survive the great flood. They asked Sals to take pity on them. After many days, a crow came and landed on the bow of the canoe. He was carrying a stick and was talking to the people. The crow had brought good news. Suddenly, a mountain began to emerge in the distance. One of the men said, Translated, this means, look at what is emerging, as he pointed to the mountain emerging in the distance. Beautiful sunrise and a mountain. It's probably a really nice sight after having absolutely nothing but water. Before they left the mountain, they gathered around the huge coil of cedar rope and gave thanks. They said, from now on, this mountain will be called Lachwilnu, place of refuge, escape, and healing. They further said, we will be called the Wasanich, the emerging people. Sals heard their prayers and said he would not punish the people by flood again. And so that's the end of the story. I think that it's really, beautiful that Lachwilnu, like the name of the mountain from the story, is the place where the Wasanich people came into being. And also a place of refuge, escape, and healing that is being brought back to life in the name of the tribal school. I'm going to touch on this a bit later, but one big teaching that from working with elders in the community I've gained is that, the way that cultural heritage is managed in the dominant framework of consulting archaeology, it's more of a business side of things. There's a lot of community members that they want more than just areas recorded, artifacts numbered and put in museums and stored away, because that's documenting people's connections to place, but it's not really sharing them, holding them up, and bringing them forward. And so one role that's been really important in the work that I've been doing is trying to bring the work that's happening within archaeology into the school to hold up the past and to bring that work forward. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's really, really interesting to me that Lachwilnu is, the name of this mountain, this place of origin and history for the Wasanich, and then also the name of the school. I think that ties in really nicely with the way that elders have been telling me that they want to be able to use archaeological work that's being done. But back to my origins in archaeology. After I graduated from UVic, I ended up working for a consulting group, and really turned out to be not quite the same as getting to do this incredibly enriching fieldwork where we were able to do faunal analysis and get radiocarbon dates and do all of these incredible pieces of scientific work that helped us to have a better understanding of the place, to be able to tie that in with the information that Tahltan First Nation had and the legal cases that they had going on. That work felt really complete. It felt integrated into a larger framework of understanding connections to place over time. And doing consulting work, you would get applications from different developers, whether they're residential or the area that I was working, like, the municipality or different companies that are coming in and doing work there. And you basically are working within a system where the person or the archaeologist who has the lowest bid is able to do that work, because the developers will choose that person who it's going to be the least cost to them. And that often results in people recording things and doing the bare minimum in line with the Heritage Conservation Act, but not necessarily doing all of the little pieces that really lead to more integrated understandings of place and histories, or doing any work that is bringing that work forward for the nations that history you're working with. And also a lack of information being shared between archaeologists and First Nations, often in these situations where we've got far less than perfect streams of communication and capacity at that. So I, to an extent, got very lucky because, I'm far from the only person who's noticing that these things are playing out and have been for, the past 50 odd years in consulting. And before then, there wasn't even really a stable consulting framework. It's all a process of the history of BC archaeology. But basically, at the provincial level, as I was sharing on my screen before, that I'll get up again, there is currently, here we go, this is stage one, the collaborative kind of, well, we've got phase one at the start is where the province is at right now, but there's an overarching project going on where by the provinces trying to work with as many First Nations and individuals within First Nations as they can to ameliorate how heritage management happens. And a lot of those issues that people are speaking to are really complex and nuanced, and they're grounded at more local levels. And the province is acknowledging that, but still working forward at a provincial scope because that's the scope that they're capable of setting legislation at. And so there's a lot of work that needs to happen at the local level. Um, for example, with employing Indigenous law into the context that heritage management is happening, upholding and really looking to elders and knowledge holders for interpreting archaeological findings and figuring out, histories of place together with archaeology and oral history being seen as side by side. Also, listening to informed perspectives of how people within First Nations want those histories to be brought forward, because at the end of the day, these cultural heritage, like kind of legacies, are the property of the First Nations whose heritage they are. That's outlined within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the main reason that this change in legislation came forward is because BC signed on to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in 2019. And better management of cultural heritage is one of the two primary asks of First Nations from across BC. The better management of cultural heritage and upholding the rights and opportunities of youth are like the two top priorities in that like legislation that's been brought forward between First Nations and the province. So it's pretty important to be doing this work better than we currently are. And so, yeah, this is the timeline that's laid out at the provincial level, but my work itself is more focused on the kind of local level because this is the work that the province, they don't have the capacity to do because it's on a local scope. But, these big conversations about, well, how do we have better relationships between municipal governments and First Nations? And how do we have Indigenous law being held up and put in place within like the consulting work that's happening? How do we have, better resource management and distribution to like the people who are on the ground doing this work that need it? Like those are all questions that are going to vary from place to place. And so that's why my work ended up becoming so important to put kind of in line and in conversation with this larger provincial project, is because I am documenting those kinds of conversations and questions and critiques that are coming up at the level of working at Salish. So I guess the next question is, who here has been to Cordova Bay? Probably a lot of people. And I mean, for myself as well, I only learned about the village of Salish and, the broader history of the Wasanich people on the kind of northern to like mid part of the peninsula a couple of years back when I was doing my undergraduate work. But, these histories are right there in place. And so while we were working there at this village site at Salish in Cordova Bay, right near where the Beach House restaurant is, for people that may be somewhat familiar with that area, residents who are living right on top of where this village is and was located and was built up at, they had no idea. And, that's one step towards coming to a kind of understanding of the amount of potential for sharing about these histories that are located in place is because we've got so many people coming up from their balcony, from their next door, asking about this project and wanting to learn. And through doing this archaeological work, they were able to come forward and start to have those conversations about, well, we live in an area that, of course, has Indigenous history, but getting a specific idea of, what kind of activities are happening right here, how people were looking out at the water and fishing for a whole list of different species and making cedar ropes on the shore and living on a longhouse that is right underneath where we were standing. So it's pretty powerful stuff for people to be able to engage with on that kind of tactile material level. And yeah, more broadly, just really a kind of powerful beginning for people to start to think about, maybe this could be shared in public schools as well as at Lochwaynu, like the tribal school. And there could be like youth coming forward who are growing up understanding the kind of multiplicity of this place that is Cordova Bay and like largely a residential area in the present, but also has this incredible past. And how can we revitalize some of the practices that were happening here? How can we keep the water clean for people to be able to fish? All of these questions and ways of thinking about this place are interconnected. And they're really important for building up a future together when, under this area is actually under the South Saanich Treaty, which was signed between Governor Douglas and members of the Wasanich First Nations. And in that treaty, they're speaking to, rights to fish as formally, rights to be able to continue traditional harvesting methods, like all these different aspects that can be shared very well when you're bringing together these cultural histories of place and these activities that are happening in place with the archaeological record. And yeah, I just like having visual representatives for being able to share things. So I think that was really powerful. Now, this is us working in place. One of my cohort, Rachel, who's another master's student, and she's working more specifically on the right to fish as formally because there's also a very complex large stone fish trap near where Gailey Brook comes out in Cordova Bay. There's just so much sustained and incredible interaction with these places. And what we've got there in between our hands is it's a little bit disintegrated, but we're working through a house floor and we've got a large elk scapula there that we're trying to bring together out of the midden that we were working through there. So it's pretty crumbly, but it's just really interesting to think, what would it have been like to be here in this area when there were big elk roaming around. We don't really get that anymore, largely because of the effects that urbanization has had on this area. But with the archaeological record, you get to think in that way of what would this landscape look like? If we've got all these different species that we're uncovering again and again here, what would we need in this area to be able to sustain those populations again? Or what would this area have looked like back when those populations were able to be sustained? These are some really interesting ways to think about how fluid the kind of relationships a place can be, and how much can change in 100 or so years. Now, one other note that's really worth bringing to the forefront before I kind of head into a closing part of what I want to speak about today is the fact that this work was able to happen outside of the consulting framework. This work, because in the consulting framework that I mentioned, having worked only really 6 months in, because I just did not really enjoy the way that our work was limited, and I got lucky enough to have the opportunity to go back to school and do work outside the consulting framework. But with consulting, it's the developer who's paying for archaeological work that's happening. Some people may be familiar with that if you have a house that's on an archaeological site, if you're a landowner and it's ever come up for you, you've got archaeological testing or surveying that's having to happen. You don't want to necessarily pay a lot of money for that work to happen. And the way that that system is set up, it allows for, very much the minimum amount of archaeological work to be done, and for development to go forward. And that's not good work for anyone, really. That's a laundry list of what was located there and a lot of destruction. Um, so, more and more, it's really important, first of all, hopefully, for the provincial framework to change in some regard, but to hold up the alternative ways that people are able to do archaeological work. So the work that we were doing at Salish at this village site was funded through the University of Victoria and various provincial and federal grants to be able to uncover and uphold this history. And we're working in partnership between my supervisor, Brian Tom, and the Sayote First Nation, as well as more broadly, the Wasanich Leadership Council. And so through the kind of associations and collaboration that we had with the First Nations we were working with, we ended up with research questions that were guided by what those First Nations wanted to uncover about a village site that has their own history and the ways that they wanted it to be shared, which is first and foremost with their youth, which I find really incredible. For them to, be able to say, okay, like, what are we looking for? What kinds of things would be important for us to know about this area? And first and foremost, they really wanted to be able to kind of expand the polygon, because areas currently get protected within like polygons on maps. And so being able to test further and further into different areas where there weren't recorded archaeological sites, and along with the kind of oral history and stories of elders, we tested in areas that they thought that there would be archaeological material, and there was. Not really a surprise, but that work, just nobody had the capacity or the funding to do it before. So we were able to do that work on the ground, which was really exciting. And then to be able to share resources with the school, with the youth who are like growing up and wanting to learn about their own history. And then, as I mentioned, hopefully more broadly in public schools as well, so that all youth in this community can learn about the longstanding relationships with place that people have had here over thousands of years. And also just thinking about all the different ways there are to relate to the landscape, and thinking beyond a lot of the confines of capitalism and private property that a lot of us have in our mind growing up today. Not to say that, there's obviously concepts of property that are being employed here, but just thinking about those things as more fluid concepts, I think, is integrated into students' learning as they grow up and do social studies. And why not make those lessons local rather than, always having to go and learn about Egypt and the pyramids? Now, one thing that I thought was really interesting was a lot of people who are living in Cordova Bay currently are coming to the site, and they're wanting to help out. They're wanting to be a part of the work that was happening, but not really knowing how. And as I've mentioned throughout this conversation, there's a lot of issues that come back to capacity, and capacity often comes back to money because, let's face it, we do live within a system that is very constraining when you aren't going to be making money for the work that you're doing. And archaeological work that is very fringe, not really in line with like the more dominant way of doing consulting work, doesn't necessarily make people a lot of money. And so nation members who are implicated in doing this kind of work, wanting to, hold up their cultural teachings, who have, archaeological experience, whatever it be, when you're working in a capacity that isn't in line with the dominant framework, you're often not going to be making a lot of money. And that's because there's no funds put aside for this kind of work. And more broadly, there's a group called Reciprocity Trust that's being set up in BC. They've actually just in June launched their specific to like the peninsula area page, where you can basically give back 1% of either your rent or your property tax or whatever relationship you have to the property that you're living on. A percentage of that can be given back to the communities, like the First Nations whose land you're living on. And so there's a council of 13 nations who are all tied to this area, that when you sign on to be a member of Reciprocity Trust, your money is going into a trust that they are able to work together to distribute towards worthy causes that they want to put money and resources into. And that's just, I think, a really cool way of being able to shift some of that balance of power back towards First Nations having a little bit more jurisdiction over their own lands, especially in areas like this that are fairly urbanized. And, that can create a lot of restrictions on countless traditional practices of hunting, fishing, and just relationships to place that are often obstructed. And so I think that this is a really cool start, and I'm really excited to see where this initiative goes. But yeah, this is something that we got to talk to a lot of people coming through the project about, and a lot of people signed on, which was really awesome. And so I encourage people who are attending today to take a look at this, because although it's quite, disparate maybe in some ways from doing archaeological work on the ground or learning about archaeological work, it definitely will kind of circle back to more work of the kind that was happening at Salish happening in the future. And finally, my last slide is, I like to think that having everybody from my field team smiling out at you all as you receive this information is a kind of thank you for listening. I think that it's really important for more work of this kind to happen, for more people to be able to engage with archaeological work, and just in general with the histories of the places that we call home. And I think that through archaeological work is a really powerful way to do that, as was very much demonstrated at Salish. And yeah, thinking about carrying that work forward. The woman in the center there holding the sign, Mavis Underwood, she is an incredible elder and a very big guiding force for me, who she talks a lot about in Wasanich law. You've got teachings and responsibilities. It's kind of like how you would break down the concept of law as it is as an overarching entity. And so through my work at Salish, I received a lot of teachings, and now you're all here receiving some of these teachings from me, and thinking about how you break down those teachings and they become your responsibilities. So I think that that's a really interesting way to think about knowledge. If I know that that fish that you just picked up is poisonous, I have a responsibility to tell you it is. And if I am taught that, there's all these long-standing relationships to place, and I'm trying to figure out what my responsibilities to these places are, then I'm going to bring you along on my journey and tell you about the ways that I'm doing work specifically within heritage conservation to try and shift how that framework is laid out. And tell you about the little things that I learn about on the long path that we're kind of all on towards truth and reconciliation, which, as my mom Amanda told me to mention, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is coming up. And I think that it's just a really interesting, conversation today about how these kinds of conversations, they tie back into our everyday life. And, the more that you can think about relationship to place and learn about the nations whose land you're on, like the more kind of nuance of a perspective you get about how to contribute towards those very big concepts of truth and reconciliation. So that's all for now. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I will let you all go and have tea, cookies, and a conversation. Bye, everybody, and thank you.